Hello, come in and let me tell you something about Ludham.
Martin, how did you first come to live in Ludham?
Well, we used to come for holidays after the war. I had relations who lived in Cromer, and so we used to spend our annual summer holiday with them. And then when I was about 14, I was obviously so keen on Norfolk, I cycled up from Birmingham to Cromer in a day, which was a mammoth journey of 180 something miles. Setting off at 4 o'clock in the morning from Birmingham and getting to Cromer at about 5 o'clock in the evening. But when I was about 15, I started painting, and I became very interested in the work of Seago because I'd come across a book in the library in Birmingham called A Canvas to Cover, and I found the paintings sort of evocative of Norfolk, and I decided that I'd like to do some painting down here. So I wrote to Seago and said I was coming to Cromer for a holiday and would it be possible to meet him. At that time I was just about to start art school, I was about 16, and he said, well, if you take potluck on me being at home, call in. From his writings he sounded a very sort of relaxed and affable sort of person, but when I got to his house I found there was somebody who was much more grand. Anyway, my parents were sort of ushered into his drawing room, and I went to the studio and he looked at some of my paintings and said, well, would you like to come and spend a day painting with me in the studio in a couple of days' time? So I was very excited at that prospect and turned up, and we spent a day working indoors because the weather was too bad to work outside, and I painted a still life, which I still have, and then I went off to art school for a couple of years, and I decided I really wanted to come and live in Norfolk. But the extraordinary thing was that while we were looking up Seago, my grandfather was alive at the time, and he said, well, I've got some distant relation who lives in Ludham. But I haven't seen him since about 1930. So they went and inquired at the post office, and they said, oh yes, Bob Burton, he lives just down the Yarmouth Road. So while I was at Seago's, my parents visited him, and he said, well, any time you want to come and stay, you're welcome to stay with us. And hence, when I moved to Norfolk, I lived with them for 5 years, which was quite an exciting prospect, having come from a typically suburban background in a city to moving to a very rural village, which was very different to what it is today. Things really hadn't changed very much in the last century. The population was much the same. There were many properties which were very interesting but rather run down, and suddenly I was living in a house where there was no running water, a pump in the garden, and an outside privy with the as they call it, the honey cart coming every once a week to do the emptying job. But that was quite a common thing in Ludham in those days, like many other Norfolk villages. But it made life, it gave a sort of interesting contrast to one's sort of suburban upbringing and a totally different way of life. And of course, in those days, there were many more people working on the land, and very few people had cars, and you'd see people all cycling off to the various farms, and even one or two people were still using horses. I remember Edward Seago's father kept a Percheron horse which he used on his farm for certain jobs. So there was lots of sort of excitement there, but there was nothing much for entertainment. So most of my evenings were spent in the King's Arms, which at the time was kept by the Billington family, with whom I got on extremely well, and were a very jolly couple. And they said to me, well, if you'd like to put some of your paintings up in the bar, or the lounge bar, we'll sell them for you. So I put about 6 paintings up there, and it was quite interesting that the first batch I put up, I was a little short of ready cash, and I'd taken a job for 3 days helping Clifford Kittle on his farm threshing corn, which must have probably been almost the last time a threshing machine was used in Ludham. And that was quite an experience. I remember climbing up to the top of the rick and finding, God, this is pretty high up here. And it was all right until we sort of got to the levelled off part of the stack, and then it got harder and harder, and the more tired you got, the harder it was because you had to push the sheaves of corn up. And I did this for 3 days until we'd done the 3 stacks, and I got the princely sum of £6. And I remember coming back covered in blisters and going up to the pub in the evening, and the landlady said, "Oh, I don't want to get you overexcited, but someone's coming and they want to buy all your paintings." So I turned up the next morning. This group of farmers from Suffolk said, "Right, we'll take the lot. Can we do a deal?" So I said yes, and so they went away very happy, and I was extremely happy, going off to the bank with some ready cash, which was a considerable contrast to actually threshing corn.
Where did you do your painting? Did you have a studio?
Well, fortunately, there was a little empty or derelict cottage in the grounds of Rose Cottage, which is next door to Manor View, which had been empty for some time, and that belonged to Cyril Thrower and his family, and I was allowed to use that free of charge. It was very basic. The walls were green with damp, and there wasn't any heating in it, so in the winter it was pretty cold, and one wrapped up in layers of clothes and gloves. But it was all part of the sort of feel of living in the country at that period, and it was at a time just a few years before things started to change more dramatically, because in those days the Baker's Arms still existed on Yarmouth Road, and so that was quite a narrow entrance into the village. It was rather an interesting building, and it was a great tragedy that it was knocked down later for road widening, because it was the beginning of the rot of losing so many important buildings in the centre of Ludham. Had those buildings remained a few years longer, they would have been beautifully restored now, and we'd have had a very fine high street.
Did you see much of Seago at this time?
Well, I used to go and see Seago perhaps once a week. I'd take down a little box of works that I'd done, and he'd cast his eye over them. But he was not an easy person. He turned out to be frightfully snobbish, and I remember him saying to me, "I don't have anything to do with anyone in Ludham, not even the Boardmans." Well, I don't think the Boardmans would have been terribly interested, as they weren't they were more the sort of shooting fraternity. But anyway, he sort of tolerated me going down, and at one time when I was actually at art school, he said to me, would I like to meet him in London for a day, and we went to the Tate Gallery together and sort of viewed the French Impressionist paintings, which was very interesting and exciting at the time. But he wasn't someone you could relax with. He kept you very much at a distance and played the part of the great man. Seago had lots of very influential people, so it was always interesting to know who was visiting the house. And his cook, Annie Thompson, she lived in Lovers Lane with her brother Charlie, who kept a small nursery and greenhouses at the other end of Lovers Lane from us. And so she'd often be saying, "Oh, we've got Lord and Lady so-and-so staying this weekend," or Field Marshal Alcanek, or Field Marshal Lord Alexander. So there were lots of top brass who went there, including, of course, members of the royal family, which is quite well known. And so he carried a certain aura, but really no one in the village really knew much of him at all. Yes, I used to get up and go out sort of about 8 o'clock in the morning, summer and winter, with my easel. In those days I didn't have any transport, so I used an old bicycle and travelled around the village with an easel and a box of paints, and would set up and work till lunchtime, and then later on I'd probably work in the little cottage studio I had on developing things further on. But I really got to know Ludham very well, all the sort of nooks and crannies and all the buildings, and I was always going about making sketches, so that I always had something in the mind. And it was a very interesting time, because I can remember painting down at Womack again, the change of another era, because wherries used to still come up to Womack and load sugar beet and reed. And they used to take the sugar beet to Cantley factory. Of course, they didn't have sails on by then. They were equipped with diesel engines. And I have a painting which I could show you, which I did in 1958, which would have been again almost at the end of the era of taking sugar beet by wherry to Yarmouth. While I was first in Ludham, I used to get an invitation to go and see Seago's exhibitions in Bond Street each year, which I always found very interesting and enjoyed, and one often rubbed shoulders with quite well-known people like Peter Cushing, I remember seeing there, and Michaela Dennis, who did that amazing programme in the sort of 50s with Armand and Michaela Dennis, because Edward Seago's brother, he was in Africa as a sort of big game hunter collecting animals for zoos, and he was out there with a lad from Ludham called Tony Parkinson, whose family used to live at Ludham Bridge. Yes, I had my first exhibition in Norwich in 1962 at the Assembly House, and it was extremely successful, and it was very much sort of traditional paintings of East Anglia, which people enjoyed, and I sold most of the work in there. And I remember going round to Seago's after that and saying to him, oh yes, I had a very successful show in Norwich, but that was the end of the relationship. I wasn't invited indoors again, and we didn't have any further contact. But I gathered from other people and reading his biography that was the way things were. He didn't particularly like any form of competition. And the last time I saw him alive was in Bond Street. I'd moved to live in London in 1966 because I felt I needed to get a much broader perspective on the art world than being in Ludham. And I was parking my bicycle in Bond Street, and he came along and said, "Oh, I see you travel by bike now." And I informed him it was the best way to move around in London, and that was the last time I actually spoke to him. But by the time I'd got to the age of about 23, I'd become less charmed by his work, and I found them rather more superficial, and they lacked a sort of more intellectual approach to art. And of course that is why really he's never been recognised in the sort of major art world. Although he's very successful at selling work, his work doesn't exist in any major public collections, and of course this rather niggled him for the rest of his life, because he was hoping to get honours and acclaim of being shown in major galleries, but this didn't happen. But on the other hand, he was very successful on the social front, which brought in a tremendous amount of sales and popularity. And today, Seago sales are always very well attended, and characters in London at that time was Albert Knights, who kept the harness makers. He was known as Knacky Knights, and his father had kept the shop before him, and he was a regular in the King's Arms. And of course, when I was sort of about 18, you always see people as being of a great age, but he probably was only around 60 at that time. But Albert was a great character, and he lived in the shop, which was absolutely an amazing mass of objects. He sold shoes, paints, turps, anything you required, and but people always came on holiday and they always wanted to meet Albert, and he would provide them often with things like dog collars or mend a shoe or a handbag where the handle had come off, because by that time, of course, most of the saddlery work for the harness maker had long since finished in the village, and he was used to provide a lot of entertainment in the pub, particularly the more gins he had. And he used to sort of get wound up quite well by the holiday makers. But he had a pet hate, and that was anything to do with councillors. because he wanted to build on a plot of land which was way outside the village development area. And so from then on he had this sort of very embittered view of anybody who had anything to do with councilling, and the older he got, the more irate he became, and it sometimes became quite difficult to talk to him. But he provided many hours of entertainment for holidaymakers, and one of the most amusing stories I can remember was that it was the first Christmas I was up here, and I'd won a Christmas cake in the raffle in the pub, and he said, "Oh, you won this cake?" He said, "I'm just going down to Horning Ferry, would you like to come with me?" So I got into his wonderful 1928 Rolls Royce with another old boy from the village called Harry King, and we trundled off with buckets and tarpaulins in the back, and he was going to drop these off at Kittle's farm at Horning in the upper street. And so we trundled down the road in the Rolls very sedately at about 20 miles an hour in the middle of the road, and we parked at an angle on the bank opposite the farm, and when Albert came to get in to start up, he couldn't get the thing to move, so we all had to get out and push it back onto an even keel. And then we drove down to the Horning Ferry, where he supplied them with vegetables for the restaurant. And Albert's garb in the winter was to wear a long mac that came more or less to his ankles, short rubber boots. So this was quite an interesting view of this person getting out of this sedate Rolls Royce. So we had a few drinks down there and then returned back to Ludham in a very sedate pace again. But he also kept an allotment where Liz Brooks keeps her ponies now, and he had a couple of greenhouses there, and he used to take cut flowers and sell those at the shop as well. But if you look at the old photographs of Ludham, you see that he's got all his ironmongery arrayed along the wall outside the King's Arms. And he used to have an old dear called Emily Tidman, who had a cleft palate and was a little simple. He used to keep an eye on the shop for him while he was in the King's Arms, and you'd be in there and you'd get a rat-a-tat-tat on the window, and he'd say, "Blast, another £half-crown," and off he'd go, serve a customer and come back in. And over the years he managed to pick a hole in the net curtains where he peered out to see what was going on. And sort of once a week he'd buy Emily Tidman a fish and chip off the fish and chip cart for her, keeping an eye on the shop for him. But that was all of a sudden, you know, that sort of moved on. He became ill and died in about 1966 probably. Of course, you had the Boardmans who lived at How Hill, and of course at that time it was still occupied as a family house. And that had been built at the turn of the century and designed by Edward Boardman, who was an architect in Norwich. He was also Sheriff of Norwich, and they were obviously very wealthy, and they were going to make a much larger house there, but at the advent of the First World War that put an end to that plan, and so the house remained more or less at the size it is today. But they were very pleasant people. I remember meeting old Mrs. Boardman, who was a coalman before she married, and she was then about 90-something, which to someone of sort of 20 seemed an enormous age. But they had these beautiful gardens which have been continued since it's been taken over as a trust, and they used to have them open every year for the rhododendrons and azaleas, as they still do. And that brought an enormous lot of people into the village to see the grounds of the house. Changed quite a lot. I decided that I needed to go and live in London, which was a much more sort of exciting art centre than it was living in East Anglia. So I spent 3 years living there. I returned from London in 1969. There had already been a major dispute in the village over the public right-of-way at How Hill. When Norfolk County Council took over the running of How Hill as an educational centre, they decided that they'd close the public right-of-way, which ran from the road down to the public staith. As a result of this, the Ludham Society was formed, and it was contained Joan Clark, who became the secretary, Phyllis Goody, who was the chairman, Dr. Gabriel and Diana Gabriel, Nancy Legg, Charlie Thompson, who lived at Wembley Cottages, and Vi Bensley. And there was a public inquiry, and the parish council was also supportive of retaining the right of way, and they eventually won the day, and the footpath remained open. But as a result of that, the Ludham Society was then a formed organisation, and when I came back in 1969, they said, would I like to come to some meetings? And I didn't go to the first one or two, and then I got sort of involved in I remember I wrote a letter to the press about the destruction of, actually it was in Sutton, where they knocked down a rather nice farmhouse and felled a lot of trees. And I was really irate about this, and I wrote a strong letter saying, how much of the countryside had been destroyed in the sort of post-war era by the pulling up of hedgerows and trees, and demolition of important buildings. And the problem with so many buildings, they weren't listed at that time, so there was no protection for them, and people also didn't have the interest in old buildings that they have today. So after attending a couple of meetings, when it came to the AGM, I got elected as vice chairman. I was elected as chairman sometime in the early 1970s, and I've had that post ever since. As people know, in various societies, it's always quite difficult to get other people to take over these jobs. But it's been very interesting because with my interest in the countryside and architecture, it enabled me to get onto other things as well. And I very soon became involved with the Council for Protection of Rural England, and I became a member of their executive committee, which eventually led to me for a time being on their National Executive Committee as a representative for East Anglia. And in a way, my speciality became architecture, restorations and new buildings, which has been sort of a whole aspect of life which I didn't anticipate happening when I first came to Ludham. But the Ludham Society, we made comments on planning applications that we felt were not suitable for the village. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. We also battled for keeping open public rights of way, and also to try and get replacement of hedgerows and trees which had been pulled up. And many members did tree planting. I was a governor at Ludham School, and I thought it would be rather a nice idea if the Ludham Society helped to set up a school nature reserve. Because I remember when I was at school in Birmingham in the 1940s, we had a nature reserve in a sort of suburban area in our school where the developers had left a little woodland, and how exciting it was when you were a small child to go on a nature ramble on what was probably quite a small area. And I thought, in Ludham and many villages, because agriculture is so much more intense these days and heavy machinery moving around, children can't wander through the countryside in the free way that they would have done in earlier times. So we got together with the county council and the school governors, and Nancy and I pioneered setting up this school nature reserve with the help of various members of the society, and we decided we'd plant something like a woodland walk leading onto a small meadow and then into a wood, and then near the school we had a pond, and this has now grown over the last 15 years to quite a sort of wooded area, and is a very useful part of the educational curriculum now. But also Nancy and I did plant a lot of trees around Ludham over those years, several hundred in various areas, some over on Peter Boardman's land at How Hill, some on the Yarmouth Road, and various other spots, including some chestnuts in Lovers Lane, which were given to us by Mr. Beaumont. So over the years, I hope that the Ludham Society has had some influence for the good. And it's interesting how, as the people say, if you live long enough, things go full circle. And whereas all the trees, so many trees and hedgerows were pulled out in the post-war era because of the agricultural need for farming more land, now there's a surplus of land because there is a greater yield in crops. So farmers have now been encouraged with the same sort of grant aiding to replace hedgerows which are taken out. And now one of our members, Laurie Ritchie, has put an enormous amount of hedging on his land. So things are looking hopeful again, because that hopefully will increase the number of bird species and a better ecological balance in the countryside. It's one of the things we've been very keen to encourage over the last few years is having talks which will educate people onto all sorts of aspects of the countryside. So we put forward a very positive view on many aspects of nature conservancy and architecture, restoration, and so we run about 5 talks a year on different aspects, and we manage each year to get experts on various fields to talk about their particular work. I mean, for instance, this year we're having someone to talk about bats. We've had someone talking on management of waterways and architecture and restoration of historic buildings and dating historic buildings, and also architects talking about building environmentally responsible buildings which use less energy than conventional building. So hopefully some of this stuff rubs off on people over the course of time, and we very much enjoy running it ourselves and absorbing all this sort of information. Another of the things we've done in recent times is, in conjunction with Laurie Ritchie at Ludham Hall, he's taken us on farm walks for at least probably the last 5 or 6 years, which I think is very important, so that people who perhaps have come new to a village get an understanding of how a modern day farm functions and the problems that are in agriculture, so that people don't make snap decisions on what somebody's doing wrong when they're not particularly well informed. And we found these absolutely fascinating, and most of the members who come, or all the members who come, thoroughly enjoy it, and seeing the type of conservation work that goes on the farm. And recently we've seen that Laurie and Alison have won an award for the best farm on the Crown Estates for their hedgerow planting and conservation management. So it's a wonderful thing. It's all part of how the village changes over the years. You know, 1 minute 50 years ago you've got so many things changing and being torn out, and now you've got things being put back, and people are much more aware of the importance of conservation in the countryside. For the last 20 years or so we've had our garden open in aid of the Ludham Society, but also put in a donation to another charity such as the Quidnham Children's Hospice or Talking Books for the Blind and various other things. And each year that just raises a little money which we split between the two. But we've also done it for the church because they've had this major fundraising scheme. And last time we had probably 400 or 500 people around the garden on the open day, which was quite amazing. They came from all areas. We had holiday makers on the Broads, and they turned up from Brighton and Basildon, and people were very appreciative and thoroughly enjoyed Nancy's great collection of old-fashioned roses and cottage garden plants and the topiary box and yews. So that has been a great success. A project I was very pleased with that I'd been involved with was a few years ago when Pike's nursery closed and the land was up for development, and there was an application to go in for building a small bungalow estate there, and I felt that it would be an inappropriate sort of entrance to the village, so I thought it would be much nicer if we could build a terrace of housing which matched up with the line of the road going into the village and linked up with the feel of the historic part of the village. So I made some drawings, and the parish council sent those on to North Norfolk District Council, and they approached the developer and said, well, if you develop something along these lines, we will be pleased to give you planning consent. So hence Pike's development started, but they managed actually to get one more house in than they would have done had they had a bungalow development. There should have been an archway linking the two parts of the project together, but unfortunately the builders went bankrupt halfway through, so that part of it was never completed. But what I wanted to do was to create cottage gardens at the front and get all the car parking behind the buildings, so that you've got a more traditional view of the village. There's nothing worse than arriving in a village and seeing quite nice houses and everyone's got 2 or 3 cars in the front garden. And I think that works very successfully, and now the gardens have matured, it looks very, very nice as you enter the village in the summer. And it has been used quite extensively and put onto the County Council and the Broads Authority lists of ideas for good design in villages. But there was also a very amusing spin-off, which I never expected, that the Country Life magazine got in touch with me, and then they wanted me to do an article about buildings around Norfolk which fitted in with the countryside. And they came and had a look at Pikes, which wasn't actually complete at the time, and photographed it, and they wrote this article about how Martin Walton had saved Ludham from a fate worse than death by designing some houses that fitted in with the countryside. And I thought no more about it until I got a letter from Country Life saying, "I'm sure you'll be interested in this speech by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who was speaking to the Royal Town Planning Institute on being made president," and he made the amusing remarks, "There is an artist in a village in Norfolk who can design buildings which fit in with their environment." So, as I said, you never know whose table the Country Life magazine over the years I've been very interested in how buildings fit in with the countryside, the use of materials for that particular area, and also promoting good sort of contemporary design. And it was quite nice when we had the chance to do alterations to our 1960s bungalow in Lovers Lane, which had been a traditional 60s building. And we all said, "Nice garden, pity about the house." And then when we had some money to spare and I needed a bigger studio space, I said, well, what we could do is take the roof off, go up half a storey and rebuild it, and then clad the building in black timber and put on a porch. And that has come together really well. It's created a wonderful studio and living space with wonderful views over the countryside. And we received an award from CPRE for its contribution to the countryside. So we've been very, very happy with the result. Going back to the 60s, unfortunately there wasn't the same awareness in the general public of the importance of many of the historic buildings, and so much of the interesting street we had in Ludham, which dated back in many cases to sort of the 1600s, was swept away at a stroke because the whole lot belonged to one person, and they were in a fairly run-down state, and one building had been damaged by fire, and at the time there was no great interest in restoration, and unfortunately the whole lot was bulldozed, and for a long time it was an empty site, and then eventually Drycon came and they did the redevelopment of Latchmore, which, had I known what I know now about architectural ideas, I think one could have improved on, but you can't turn the clock back. Yes, there was the whole list of things that disappeared at that time, the whole street, and then there was the sad loss of the Baker's Arms, which was a very nice building, and had it remained would have been restored and we'd have had another pub in the centre of the village. In its day it was only a beer house, but these days it would have become probably a very smart restaurant. But it was so much a typical building of Norfolk, and the pity is that it was actually a much nicer building than the King's Arms, and it made a very nice visual appearance as you approached the village from the Yarmouth direction.
Have you any idea how old it was?
I would have thought it was probably 1800-ish, and it was kept by the Warren family, and Paul Warren, who lives in the village, is the grandson of Harry Warren, who kept the pub. And then there were the maltings at Womack. They were rescued by being turned into holiday accommodation, but there were some lime kilns next to them which were, unfortunately, they were knocked down at the same sort of period, and there was a very nice barn that fell down at Fritton, where Nicky Brooks lives now, which at the time was just about to become listed, but it fell down overnight. Ludham had several sites of brick kilns at High Mill, and then there were the remains of brick kilns at Womack, and there was a lime kiln which is partly in existence in the grounds of Staithe House in Staithe Road, where he's used to come up and collect lime and take it off to various parts of Norfolk. Up until the early 20th century there used to be the Staithe into Staithe Road, hence the name Staithe Road, but after a court battle which Dr. Gordon won, he lived at the manor and claimed that it was private property and non-tidal, and he won this appeal, and so we lost the Staithe on Staithe Road, which had functioned for a long time. Dr. Gordon, he lived at the manor and was quite an influential doctor. This was long before my time in Ludham, and when he retired, Dr. Brown came to Ludham in 1918 with his two daughters Nita and Rona, and he took over the practice in Staithe House, which in those days was called Riverside, and he practiced here until the formation of the National Health Service in 1948, and then the practice was taken over by Dr. Wilson, who was here until the 1960s, followed by Dr. Gabriel.
Can you tell me about the fairy garden at the...
Well, yes, Mrs. Brooks, who bought the manor, I'm not quite sure what date she took it over, but she was a fairly eccentric lady and became a little bit of a recluse, but she created this interesting fairy garden which was greatly loved by holidaymakers who could come up from Womack, cross a little bridge in Horsefen Road and walk through the grounds and be served with teas in what had been huts used by the army during the war. And this created a great deal of interest and amusement to the general populace. There was an amusing story where she had some giant beans and giant tulips, and some naughty lads in the village floated them down Womack and finished up in the magistrate's court and had a ticking off.
So how long was she
and she was there until she died in about the 1970s. And then the Gabriels took over the house, but they didn't live there for some time, and there was an interesting group of young people who rented the house. One young chap was a violin maker. Another couple, he was a lecturer at the Open University in maths, and there was a girl who taught printmaking at Yarmouth Art School, and someone else who did weaving, and a chap who was a thatcher. So it was quite a mixed bag of people, and they opened a sort of craft and art gallery down there which ran for a few years until eventually they all moved off and did their separate things. But Doug, who was a thatcher, I saw him thatching in Ludham down by the Dog only recently, and Gerald Adams, who was the violin maker, is a furniture maker somewhere near Brook now. So that was another interesting phase in the changing pattern of the way buildings are used in the village. And recently we became friendly with some people called Greenwood who lived at the Stone House in Ludham, which was lived in prior to that by Mrs. Pegg, who'd been there for about 60-something years. And because Mrs. Pegg didn't have very much money, not much was done in the way of repairs, so the house had remained fairly unspoiled. And when the Greenwoods had finished restoring it, and then they decided to move, they gave us several buckets of rubbish which they'd taken out of the chimney, which included old shoes and various other items, pieces of fabric and bits of writing. And we started sifting through them, and Nancy found it a filthy job, and we put them to one side for a time. And then by pure chance we recently went to a lecture at UEA on something called spiritual middens, and this was how people buried things in chimneys or under floors, under thresholds, under windows to keep out evil spirits. And we suddenly realised that this is what we'd got from the Stone House. So Nancy's been doing a lot of research into it and recording all this information, and we're in touch with the man who gave the lecture, and we referred to Beulah, who'd got a lot of information on the Johnson family, because she'd met a survivor of that family, and the Johnsons in the 1700s were quite important tanners, and that was a tannery. And Mr. Johnson at the time brought out a patent on a new way of curing leather, and he had to go to London and be presented to the King to receive the patent for his technique, and this cost him 78 guineas. But he also had to have a special suit made to travel down to London and meet the King. And then he sold off the rights to use his patent to other people, but he was quite a wealthy man. And there was also an excise officer who lived somewhere down between there and Ludham Bridge, and he used to have to come up and check the leathers for collecting the taxes on each hide that was produced. So that was another interesting part of Ludham, and that's why that's no doubt called Johnson Street. So it's just surprising that how one little thing can lead to a fascinating story of finding out about others. I mean, Beulah is the great expert on everything and where everybody's buried in Ludham, and I gleaned a lot of information from her. Well, that just about sort of concludes a sort of resume of some of the things I've sort of noticed in my life, in probably 40-something years of living in Ludham. But there's lots I haven't mentioned, and will kick myself when it's over that I haven't brought it up now. But that's why this archive project is such an important thing, because it's collecting everyone's memoirs and putting it together as an ongoing project for future generations, because history is created today. Right, having mentioned about my early days coming to Ludham and my connections with Seago and how life moves on, and what one matures and absorbs many more influences from further afield, I thought it'd be quite interesting for you to see how much my work had changed from the days when I was a young painter influenced by Edward Seago to being a much more modernist painter today. I thought it'd be quite interesting for you to see some of my recent work, having talked about how I came to Ludham and was greatly influenced by Seago. And over the years I took in much more of a wider approach to the art world than just creating images of Norfolk, which I felt had been done exceedingly well by others, and one needed to move on and explore other aspects. And I've been very interested in abstract painting for many years, although for some time I did paint figurative pictures as well. But now I've concentrated mostly on working in an abstract form, which I find much more stimulating and exciting, because one never knows what the next creation is going to come out like. It's always a great battle between yourself and the canvas, but eventually you get there, and many times you're working on something you feel that you'll never achieve a successful image, and then suddenly overnight you've got it. And this is the last painting I was working on. My paintings have quite a lot of energy in the production technique of them. I tend to draw quite a lot straight from the tube of paint onto them to give a sort of very direct approach, and using strong pure colours.